Welcome. On behalf of the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books, I want to welcome you to this wonderful theater on the USD campus. You are at the Food and Culture presentation with Christopher Carter, Rebecca Ingram, and moderated by Amanda Petersen. One thing I would ask when it comes to the Q&A, we ask that you line up at the microphones rather than us passing them out. We are streaming, so if you're not at the microphone, no one streaming will be able to hear you. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Is my mic working okay? You can hear me? Okay. We are so delighted to have so many people on campus today. Those of us who've been working here all summer preparing for students are very thrilled to have so many people from the public on our lovely campus. And also to host or partially host this book festival. I'm delighted to be here with two of my colleagues. I'll start with Dr. Christopher Carter. He is a professor in our Theology and Religious Studies department, an amazing dynamic professor who is going to talk to us today about his book called The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. And some of you might have seen his book at the College of Arts and Sciences booth, and there was interest and hope of trying to buy it at the bookstore booth. So we think it's there. And then my dear colleague in the same department as me, Dr. Rebecca Ingram, and her book is coming out this fall, and it's called Women's Work, How Culinary Cultures Shaped Modern Spain. It was absolutely a delight for me to be able to read both of these books together. I've heard lots about them in bits and pieces. I know that these projects are long labors of love, as all books, yes, academic or otherwise, are always. And so it's my pleasure to be here to guide this discussion today. So I'll go ahead and get started. And one of the things that I was fascinated about by the topic, but also in reading both of these books, was I am fascinated by how this topic of food, food justice, food social justice, and food stories are combined so intricately with personal narratives from both of you. You write about these in your books, and I'm always kind of nerdy about that as well, that I'm always fascinated with, like, what is the personal connection to these labors of love that we do? So I was wondering about if you could tell us a brief example of how these are connected to your personal stories. And also, I think both of your stories kind of tell us a little bit about why these topics are so important and urgent today in our world. So we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Ingram, and then we'll move over to Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Dr. Petersen, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's a delight to be here with Christopher and also with Amanda. Personal narratives. So just to get an idea of those in the room, how many of you during the pandemic tried to bake sourdough bread? Anybody? How many of you, especially those who identify as women, noticed that your care work and your food work dramatically increased, especially during that first year of the pandemic, right? Absolutely. Y'all, that's work. Mm-hmm. That is political, right? It has consequences for how those who identify as women took care of their children, of their elders, their community members, their partners. And it's something that I've been fascinated with for a long time now. It's something I study about Spanish women in the book from 100 years ago. But it's also something that I observed in my grandmother's kitchen. And so this is a white woman, rural Georgia, post-war, high school education, and proud to graduate from high school. But for food, the mic went out.
Yeah, back.
Her garden, her chickens, her pigs, her cows. This is the way she sustained her family. This was her labor. This is the way she sustained her community. This was what had meaning in so much of her life. And so to be able to see her as a woman who went through different stages of modernization in the 20th century, to see her kitchen and to do cooking with her in that kitchen, really sensitized me to some of the issues that later on I would start studying about Spanish women from 100 years ago.
I think Interestingly, my background is a little bit more complex with respect to gender, even though in the book I talk a lot about the ways in which gender influences, but in my culture, the men do a lot of the cooking. Now, some of that's just, I think it's kind of unique to my family, but my grandfather, my maternal grandfather is a big part of the reason that I wrote this book and really was inspired by my relationship with him to kind of put pen to paper, as it were. I still start my drafts like that, actually. Put pen to paper to tell this story. So my grandfather was a migrant picker who was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi in the 1930s. And his stories of working in the fields, picking cotton, picking berries, doing all the kinds of agricultural labor work you might imagine someone might do at that period of time. You know, growing up listening to those, to me, it sounded so eerily close to when you read like Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. Like there wasn't that much of a distinction. And his experiences taught me not only to value food, but to really value those who do the labor to grow and provide our food. And he was super proud to have lifted up our family out of like generational poverty to just be poor by working, migrating to Michigan, ultimately getting a job at a factory, working there. And so I grew up spending summers helping him in his garden, unwillingly, most of the time, helping him nonetheless. And that's why I grew to appreciate, like, I was at agricultural work. And while my grandmother did a lot of the cooking, my grandfather was also someone who helped as well, so they really shared a lot of those chores. Conversely, on my father's side of the family immigrated from Spain, and they immigrated to Louisiana in the late 1800s. But they, for all intents and purposes, were understood to be white. On my father's side of the family, my great-grandfather met my great-grandmother because she was working on the plantation he was the overseer on. And so I have this one family dynamic of those who were the overseers, the plantation managers, those who were in charge of forcing labor upon people, and another side of the family who were doing the labor. And so I try to weave those throughout this story and recognize that they both are within me. I think all too often we can see ourselves as mere victims of a system without actually asking ourselves, well, how and in what ways are we complicit in this system, particularly as Americans, even as people of color who clearly disproportionately suffer from the harms. And so just to answer the second part of your question, Amanda, that for me is why this is a pressing matter, right? When you look at the consequences of global climate change, look at the consequences of what's happening with our agricultural economy, the people who are disproportionately harmed are people of color, particularly women, because women make up over 50% of the agricultural workforce globally, right?
And they still do all that care work at home.
All that care work still has to be done. Right? And so for me, this is, if we want to take women's rights seriously, if we want to take global climate change seriously, we have to address food because it is so crucial an element for us to survive as a species.
Great, thank you guys. One of the things I found, I knew this intellectually going into both of the reading, but both of these kind of bigger labels of food are so super trendy, right? So soul food, last time I was in Harlem, there was a new restaurant that was opening up that was all, getting all the hype around soul food. And Spanish food with all the talk of tapas and celebrity chefs. And then, and you'll go into this, I'm sure, and veganism also has kind of a lot of buzzwords and a lot of people have lots of opinions about all of these foods. So I was really interested in how you talk about these food traditions that everybody has a notion of. It's not, none of us don't have at least an idea of what soul food is or have, played around with tapas and quote unquote Spanish food. So I think a lot of people, and probably people in this audience, have opinions about what the food traditions are or should be, or what they represent, or what they symbolize, and what that symbolizes in greater intersectional structures and even colonial powers. And so how do you explain to enthusiastic publics, like maybe this one, how your work works and how you work with these things, and how do you grapple with those of us who could be blinded by our preconceived notions of these kind of things? Whichever one wants to start.
Okay. Who wants some tapas for lunch? Y'all? I mean, y'all, they're delicious, right? Sangria, paella, these are all dishes that a general public recognizes today as meaning something about Spain. A lot of you may have heard of Jose Andres, the chef who's had restaurants in DC now for years, who's also had really important humanitarian projects in Ukraine most recently, also in Puerto Rico a few years ago after the hurricanes. When I talk about Spain and food, to my students, to folks like y'all, one of the things that I want people to understand is that how these foods come to represent Spain is very much a political process, right? If I tell you that you have an association with sangria and paella because of a dictatorship that lasted from 1939 to 1975, would that surprise you? Maybe some of you it would, maybe some of you it wouldn't, right? And so the period that I write about, really, it was Spain and an identity crisis. How does Spain continue to be Spain when it's no longer a colonial power controlling Latin America, controlling the Philippines, controlling Cuba, Puerto Rico? How is Spain Spain without that power? And how does Spain become modern as it looks into the future? And so these were political questions, these were economic questions, these were identity questions. And 100 years ago, nobody liked Spanish food, y'all. It had too much garlic, it had too much onion.
You can have too much garlic?
Apparently people thought so then. We could debate that now. It was known that if you wanted to eat well in Spain, you had to look for French restaurants. That was the only way to eat well. And so what does Spain do, right? Are we going to copy the French to learn how to be Spanish and modern? Or do we need to think about our past and think about those really dark aspects of the past, a legacy of colonialism, of exploitation? And so this identity crisis was really part of Spain's politics 100 years ago, but it was also part of the way Spaniards were negotiating what they thought about food, and what foods and culinary labor meant for its population and its society as it was modernizing.
Similarly, I think for me, with respect to soul food, is recognizing the political dynamics of it as well. Right. And so, so what happened was, I came to California from Michigan, and I came from a place where I was doing some, cooking at home, but not too much. I finally ventured away from the family, and started taking a little bit more responsibilities in the kitchen. But what really shook me was I was giving a paper in San Francisco, and I was driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco, so I was in graduate school, and I was driving along the 5, and I saw exploitation that was similar to what my grandfather would describe when we would take our annual family. We took vacations to Mississippi, to visit our family in the summer, which is like, one might say the worst time to go in July, but this is when we went every year. And my grandpa that's when he would tell these stories, because he's deeply introverted. And so that's when he would tell these stories, and we're driving by fields like, oh, this is kind of reminds me of some things I was doing. And so I saw these mostly Latinx workers in the fields, and it shook me. It shook me to my core, because I could not believe that people were still I could believe it, I guess I should say, but it like awakened me to the reality that people were still being exploited like my grandfather was. And so then I asked myself, essentially, what should soul food look like today? Like, given the structural harms of our food system, given the ways that we know it disproportionately impacts people of color, how should I eat in a way that aligns with my own cultural identity, but also my moral frameworks, right? And so that required me to do some excavation as to how we got this idea of soul food in general. And when you go back to West African diets especially, but Central and Sub-Saharan African diets as well, what you see is a much more robust diet based on fruits and grains, particularly different kinds of rices, as we're going to talk about. And you have dark leafy green vegetables, soups and stews, and meat. And so I want to be clear, but fundamentally different than the ways in which we see the kind of public face that soul food may get today, based on the kind of mass production of certain kinds of soul foods, right? And so what I had to do for me, I had to figure out a way to, again, eat in a way that not only was in line with my values, but it still allowed me to have that cultural connection to home, right? Because I'm already leaving Michigan to go to California. So right there, my family thinks I'm like some kind of hippie. Then I decided to grow dreadlocks, and they're just like, so I'm doing all these things, that's really challenging my connection to my community, and to a certain degree, really pushing at the boundaries of what's accepted from my culture of being a Black man, right? And so that is a part of the reason why I did this research, because I wanted to show how, particularly farming, which we're going to talk about later, and soul food, as it's marketed today, isn't in alignment with the ways in which even my grandfather ate as a kid versus what people may conceptualize it to be today. So I wanted to problematize that and give us a vision for what it could be, how it could be that liberatory way of eating that connects us. There's an affective dimension to food, right, that tells that story.
I see future panels coming along and discussions that we need to have, because we definitely don't have time to do all these connections. We have so many ideas and thoughts that are coming up. I'll stay mostly on script for now, so we'll be sure and have time to talk with the public. So there are fascinating specific examples in each of your books that give us kind of this insight into the brilliant unpackaging and analysis that each of you do, and there are specific examples that really illustrate things that we who are not immersed in your research wouldn't necessarily imagine. So I was wondering if each of you could share an example with the public that kind of enables us a little bit of insight into that process of analysis and thinking about food and things as political acts and representation and all of those sorts of things. So do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go and start. So one of the, I think this story didn't make it in the book, but a part of it is in another article I wrote. One experience that really profoundly shaped me in terms of my rethinking of what soul food could be was I was volunteering to lead a garden club for high school students when I was in graduate school, and I was really trying to recruit students of color. And this was a continuation school, so it's a lot of students of color. A continuation school are for students who are struggling to graduate on time. And I was trying to get the men to join, some of the young men, and they just didn't want to. They're like, I don't want to do that, I want to do that. They didn't think it was cool. But then when I finally got one of the younger Black men, like in a space where I could talk to him in private, he was like, I just don't know, he's like, I just feel like you're trying to, what are you trying to do, make me a slave? And so what I realized is there are these traumatic retentions, right, that we carry because of the forced agricultural labor that Black people have had. So there's this way in which many of us have these disconnects from the land because of that trauma that's hundreds of years ago. And so one of the projects with trying to think about soul food today is to also recapture the agricultural legacy, right, that we bring as Black people to this country. Many of the narratives based around why Black people were enslaved are centered around our docility, our less likelihood to sunburn, those kinds of things. When in fact, when you actually do the research and read the, really disgusting pamphlets that are written about what kinds of slaves to buy and when, what you see is enslavers, like good capitalists, are very clear about which Black people they want to enslave to grow which type of crops in this particular space. So for instance, if any of you are people of color or Black and you are from the Carolinas, the likelihood is you can trace your lineage to the Senegambia region in Africa, because the kind of rice that is grown in the Carolinas is the same kind of rice that's grown in Africa. It's an African grain of rice, right? And so they were stealing not only physical labor, but intellectual labor. And so I wanted to show young people and my own generation that the forced agricultural work is only a part of the story, but it's not the part, right? We have to recapture our love of the land in order to heal from that trauma and use those skills in the kitchens, right? And take that back to the kitchen to also reclaim that as a kind of sacred space as well, because there's a whole kind of trauma, I guess, wrapped up in that, particularly as it relates to women's work. And so for me, that's kind of one of the, I guess, more or less answering your question in terms of something that shook me and shaped how I wanted to make the arguments.
You know, two of the chapters in my book are really focused on these really well-known feminist intellectuals in Spain. Emilia Pardo Bazán, Carmen de Burgos. These women were exceptional. They were writing, they were conversing, they were in dialogue with all the top thinkers of their period at a time when women didn't belong there. I mean, the ideology of domesticity was still very, very strong during this period. But these two women feminists had lots to say about cooking and what cooking meant for Spain and modernity. But two chapters in the book deal with working class women. These are not women who wrote about food. These are women who did cooking. They're the women who worked in kitchens, their own kitchens. They worked in the kitchens of households where they worked as servants, in places that they worked outside of the home. And I really wanted to explore, as much as possible, how they understood cooking, how the meanings that cooking could acquire for women in that social class. One woman, Nicolasa Pradera, she started her career as a child, working in the kitchen of a very very wealthy household. She had education, she had opportunities, and she worked hard, and we see a tremendous change in her social class that almost nobody recognizes. And this is because of her cooking. Any of you have ever been to the Basque Country? Anybody ever eaten in the Basque Country? La Cocina Vasca? Like, you know, she is attributed with codifying how we understand Basque cuisine. And her roots are that of a very humble peasant woman, right? The last chapter studies the Institute of Culture and the Popular Library of Women that was founded in Barcelona in 1908. This organization was founded to bring culture to women, to give them training for the kind of work that they had to do outside of the home. You know, working class salaries weren't enough anymore to sustain households. The most popular classes taught at this institute were cooking classes. Over 40,000 women in the city of Barcelona in 1922 attended cooking classes at this institute. And so what were the consequences of this kind of training to cook right and to eat right, right? On the one hand, it's like saying education and cooking for women is something that needs to be taught. It's part of modernity. Like, this is the kind of progressive side to look at this, but there's also a dark side to this, right? Spain was changing. Remember this identity crisis? People with power feared working class women and working class men. They feared that they would identify with each other, that they would find commonalities as workers, as communists, as socialists, and that power in coming together would be dangerous for modern Spain, would be dangerous for Spain and its traditional power structures. So this cooking right that was taught at the Institute, that was considered emancipatory for women, had this darker side, right? All of these working class women who were taking classes, learning how to cook, professionalizing themselves, they were also learning middle class values. Middle class values, which, you know, were important, but also discouraged that kind of connection with other working class folks. And so, you know, this to me was fascinating to study because 100 years ago, the texts that we have from this period, who were they written by? They're written by people with power. They're written by people with literacy. They're written by people with the means to control how certain representations of food and of culture circulate. But what happens whenever we look at the cooking labor, at the work of folks who don't control those representations, and what do we see? And that was one of the, one of the chapters I enjoyed working on most, and one that I hope folks enjoy as well.
Great. We'll do this one kind of brief so we are sure to have public questions. But one of the things that is so striking and fascinating and reading many things, when reading your books is the disciplinary differences. I think even in this discussion, it might sound like you both are approaching these from very similar kinds of lenses. But I was kind of wondering if you could briefly explain a bit what your approach is and kind of how you think about it for the public-friendly kind of answer to this question, so that they can kind of see how they're unique and really different. Because I think not just on our campus, but in your respective fields, you both are forging a new field, honestly, and the way that you look at things and the way that you framed your research and your book, respectively. You guys are founders and pioneers with all of the implications that we have in that word, but in your respective fields. So could you share a little bit about that so that the public can really kind of see why you guys are both so innovative and why we're so proud to have you here as faculty?
So, again, I'm in theology and religious studies, and I'm the first Black person to be chair of the Religion and Ecology Committee at the American Academy of Religion, which, to be clear, there's not a ton of Black PhDs in religion, and so I still find myself, to an extent, of most of the Black scholars that are in religious studies and theology don't work around ecological issues as much, for lots of different reasons, I think. Actually, reasons I detail in the book. And so that's one part in terms of the kind of leadership role that I've taken within the field. For me, the reason I use theology to address food injustice was the book, as best as I could, is a book written for popular audiences. Like, it really is a book that tries to cast a wide net in terms of readability. And because the preponderance of Black people in America are people of faith, even if they don't go to a religious community every week, like statistically, they're more likely to believe in some understanding of God, particularly Christianity. I want to use that lens to assess this problem. And one of the things that I discovered in that research was that one of the challenges that I think we face as African-American Christians, to use that term specifically at this point, is that our understanding of Christianity in terms of how we practice it is often rooted in these white supremacist norms. And so I just wondered, why is it that faith communities, Black faith communities that tend to be much more liberatory and politically active, don't address issues of food insecurity and food injustice, or if they do address it, they address it in very narrow ways, not within a radical tradition that I might hope. And what I came to realize is that our understanding, the technical term is called theological anthropology, but that just basically means how we understand ourselves to be human, is often centered around performing whiteness, to be accepted, to be seen as such, right? And so that's how citizenship has been commanded within this country. And within religion, there's been a huge argument in terms of if we just act well enough, if we just behave well enough, we do respectability politics, eventually they will see us as human. And what I argue in the book is that what's flawed within this principle is that notion of humanness within a white supremacist framework. We should be seeking to transcend that. Because as you talk about with respect to colonization, so much of what it means to be human within a framework of white supremacy is centered around domination, rather than anti-oppression, rather than liberation. And so I argue for the humanization of my people and saying we have to claim that. That requires a certain sense of radical love, healing love, that I believe can move us to take this work seriously. So that's part of the reason I use theology to address food, because I think we have to deal with the internal traumas in order to work towards the external healing that, and external work that I think we need to do in order to begin to address food injustice in a real serious way.
I am in a department of languages, cultures, and literatures. This means that I teach everything from Spanish 101, hola, buenos días, ¿cómo están? Right? To courses based on my research. I talked about a dictatorship just a few minutes ago that lasted from 1939 to 1979. What you may not know is the first decade plus of that dictatorship was marked by famine. The Spanish people didn't eat. Those who were connected politically did. They had greater access to resources, but many people starved in Spain during that period. And I've wondered if, as a result of that trauma, that folks who lived through that are in their 90s today, Among Spanish historians, among folks who do Iberian studies, there's not been a willingness or an ability to look at food critically. And also politics. Politics are also part of this. So basically, my approach to these texts is to look at food as if it's a poem, as if it's a story, as if it's an image, and to use the tools of literary and cultural analysis to understand that food text, that food practice, in its context, the people who created it, the people who labored in its production. And this is what we call food cultural studies now. It's very exciting to be part of this work. When I first started working on this, I felt like it was me and 2 other people, and they were delightful and wonderful, but I'm like, where are all my interlocutors? Like, where are the people that are gonna be super excited about the things that we're finding? And it's been super fun now that there's more interest, there's more activity in understanding these food texts critically and reading about them.
Thanks, you all. Well, I have 1,000 questions if you all don't have questions, but I want to give you the space that we have to ask questions. And I'm a Mexicanist, so I'm thinking of all sorts of different things related. So Antonieta, and I think they're asking us to come up to the mic so that any of the people listening via streaming can also hear us.
Thank you very much. I am so excited about your work. I'm Mexican, and I am very interested in this question for you, Rebecca, about spices. Spain was in Latin America for 300 years, and I have been in Spain for twice. And what is the spice in the food? Why the food is so bland? And I ask people about it. I ask people about it, and they keep telling me that it's the purity of the ingredients, and I'm not convinced about that. I think there is some racism related to that. I'm on the other side of the coin. For us, corn is sacred, and I know that corn never made it. Europeans never learned how to nixtamalize corn, como nixtamal, and how to process corn to consumption. And corn in Europe is for the pigs.
For the pigs, for the cows.
And for the cows. For us, is sacred. We are made of corn. So how did that happen? Is related to the dictatorship? Is related to something before? Why they took the gold, but what about the spices?
Excellent question, Antonieta. So good.
It is a good question.
Gold. What about the spices?
I mean,
All
and
right.
also, which were the peoples who were getting food during the dictatorship? Was that just started in the dictatorship?
So, this is a fantastic question, Antonieta. Thank you so much for it. So if you consider garlic or onion a spice, you're going to be just fine in Spain. And I will say there is absolutely a mythology around the purity of the ingredient, around this fish, around this vegetable that is part of the way folks in Spain talk about their food today. I would say part of an answer to your question has to do with eating for subsistence. People ate stews, big stews. It was called la olla podrida. This was the national dish of Spain. It was whatever you could acquire. Beans, vegetables that grew in your area, the smallest bit of meat you could throw in there. There are variations throughout all the regions of Spain of this basic subsistence-based dish. So eating for subsistence until well into the 20th century through the famine that I acknowledged is absolutely part of this kind of contemporary foodscape of Spain. The other thing you bring up about racism, absolutely part of it. Right? We can see how certain products were adapted and incorporated into diets in Southern Europe, and certain products that were relegated for the animals, like corn. You see in Galicia, for example, that there are corn-based dishes, but these are dishes that come out of poverty. These are dishes that come out of a celebration of that ingredient. And so, Antonieta, I think you're signaling to the work that still needs to be done in this field, because the question that you ask is absolutely pressing, and it's something that scholars have to continue working on. So thank you for that.
So this question is in regards to the food-based and poverty-based trauma that you mentioned, and you both mentioned, because it is, I think, relevant in both cases. How do you fix that? Like, I can relate a bit. I grew up in Louisiana. My grandparents, my mom's side were sharecroppers. And so that becomes a negative thing. And to rise out of poverty is to get away from the land and get away from having to grow your own food and having to do the labor. And yet I can see now, of course, that that isn't good either. So what do we do? How do we begin to address that?
I think that's such a great question. And in Louisiana, especially if you go down, so I did a lot of field research on plantations in Louisiana, and that kind of is woven throughout the book, particularly the River Road that goes just north of New Orleans. And the argument that I make in the text, what I found to be successful in my conversations about the book in the last 9 months since that I've done the book tour, has been through stories, right? It's been the use of stories and narratives that recapture the capacity to provide for ourselves is crucial for our self-determination, right? And part of our identities, and something that allows us to not only cast a vision of who we once were, but then who do we want to be. And so that requires a real reckoning with the truth of our history, the truth of our enslavement, and actually honestly dealing with that trauma and confronting our own challenges with respect to the land and why we left and what that meant in the first place. But then also that opens up space, I believe, for the actual healing, to tend to those parts that arise, like the insecurities that come up, the fears that come up, all those parts of us that tell us that success looks like urban development, professionalization. I believe telling those stories of resistance, those stories of, within my tradition, we talk about making a way out of no way. That's what they did. They made a way out of no way. We need to celebrate that, right? And allow us to actually see that as crucial for us to be able to survive into the future. And so much of my argument about beginning to deal with those traumas is to first name them as true, reframe the lie that, for Black people especially, but I would argue this is also for Latinx communities as well. Like, we are being exploited for our intellectual labor. This is not just something that you can just be strong and just grow food. You have to be extremely intelligent, right? And so reframing it not as something that's just, physical work, but this is intellectual work. This is agricultural genius, right? So a lot of this is just reframing and telling the story in a way that I think empowers us as we move forward, rather than just seeing it as, it's just a thing we had to do to survive.
It's interesting listening to Christopher and then also thinking about the question that was just asked. There's a tendency to want to celebrate these cuisines, right? To celebrate collard greens and cornbread and really say this is cuisine of a time and a period. And you see this in Spain right now, and you see this also in Mexico, you see this in Peru. These campaigns to designate official cultural heritage of these foodways that are basically constructed on subsistence. And that is wonderful and could really be reparative of the traumas that we've talked about and that the questioner alluded to. But part of the argument I make is that it can't be uniquely celebratory. Yeah. We also have to be willing to ask the hard questions about those celebrations. And in Spain today, this is very pressing. Like, if you think about what Spain looks like in 2022 compared to 2002, you notice Spain is not just folks who are Iberian. Spain is a place that has accepted immigration from China, from Africa, from all over the world in numbers not seen previously. And so if on the one hand, if we have this celebration of Spain's cuisine and its regional cuisines, Catalan and Basque cuisine, and yet we have this Spain that looks so different now than it did 20, 30 years ago, where is there room for these cuisines, these foodways, that folks are bringing to the peninsula? And these people aren't immigrants, they aren't migrants, they're second generation, they're third generation citizens. They are as Spanish in terms of citizenship as the folks who have been there for hundreds of years. And so, I think that is interesting work And it will be curious to observe how those representations and discussions evolve.
I think, part of the reason I titled my book, The Spirit of Soul Food, is exactly what you're describing in terms of recognizing that our foodways aren't static, right?
Absolutely.
And my experience was that people are like, well, this is soul food. This is the thing Black people eat. These are the things. And again, what I realized is it's always evolved. And so what makes soul food isn't necessarily the certain items. It's more about the people who are preparing it, literally the spirit that they put into it, right? What is it that allows us to be able to feed ourselves in difficult times? What allows us to stay connected, and what gives us a sense of cultural identity that necessarily shifts based on circumstances, right? So if you're going through a famine, what Spanish food then is going to look different than what Spanish food looks later on. And so I think we have to get past this idea of fixed notions of cuisines and recognize that that's necessarily has always evolved. And that takes, this is, like I said, this is where politics come in, right? This is very political.
These are political questions and hotly debated.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, if there's one from the... Great.
So I wanted to ask a question about food deserts and that big disconnect between rural communities and big city communities.
I am super excited to answer this question. So I'm like, thank you. So what's interesting about, I would say what's fascinating about my work with respect, so my work is clearly focused on issues of race. Obviously, that's what I've talked a lot about today. What's fascinating to me is the places that have wanted me to come give a talk have been either schools that are predominantly progressive or schools that are predominantly urban, meaning they have more people of color, or rural communities. Because I specifically talk a lot about rural communities because they are the most food insecure communities, even though our food is grown and produced there, which makes no sense. They can see the food that they can't eat, right? And so there's a kind of way in which we need to obviously reimagine this system such that it doesn't exploitate the laborers, even those who are in the middle tiers of management with respect to access. And so some of this requires a movement away from the kind of concentration in capitalist structures. Quite honestly, we really have like 5 companies that really own the majority of agriculture in America. That's a big part of the problem. That's muscled out small farmers, right? So 80% of the food, what we would call the farm bill, goes to 20% of the people, like 20% of the suppliers, right? And so it goes to a really small percentage of corporations that get the bulk of the money. And that really harms any kind of small mom and pop farmer, any farmer trying to do something that's organic or something that's actually good for the earth, right? And so that's a big part of the problem with respect to rural communities. Urban communities, I tend to use the term food apartheid rather than a food desert. In part because deserts are naturally occurring phenomenons that just, happen over, thousands or, millions of years. Apartheid is accurate because you're really talking about the history of redlining and segregation. That's why these communities don't have access to food, because historically they were divided up so where they were literally on the other side of the tracks. And that's why they don't have access to grocery stores and foodways. And a lot of that's tied to not only race, but also class. And so much of our food policy, if it took rural poverty seriously, would really address urban issues as well, because they're very, very similar with respect to economic access, but also with respect to actually putting stores in place that are locally owned rather than owned by corporations. And so I talk a lot about co-ops and a lot about communities trying to own the food that they produce, own the store, right? Keeping the money within that community rather than some outside corporation. And that's some of the work you see taking place in the North Carolinas. You see some of that happening. You see some in Georgia. I can tell you about some activism that's happening up in the Bay Area. But it's fascinating, the cross-section of communities that are doing this work that take your question seriously. So thank you for bringing it up. The rural issue especially, because a lot of people don't realize that people in rural communities suffer from food insecurity when they can literally look at a farm.
And I would add on to that, as Mexicanist, and we're 25 miles from the border right now, all of the dynamics that Dr. Carter is talking about right now are also reverberated and reiterated throughout Mexico. Those same 5 countries or companies that control almost all of our food in the U.S. have taken over almost all of the land, and that used to be people who ate off the land, lived from the land, all of those kind of corporate companies have come in and controlled the farming. If you start paying attention to where your tomatoes are coming from and your avocados are coming from, they're often coming from Mexico, sometimes from Peru. But in particular, all of those dynamics that Dr. Carter are mentioning are also impacting our global food trade, because the same capitalist, and I would say capitalist colonial structures that are taking over food pathways are happening globally across borders.
Thank you, NAFTA. So, yeah, I have a whole chapter on food politics that I think tries to unpack some of this stuff, but it seems complex on the surface, but in reality, it's imminently fixable if there's momentum to do so. And I think getting the momentum is the big part of the challenge.
Thank you all so very much for joining us. Thank you both so much. It was great. Dr. Carter's book should be for sale in the bookstore, and Dr. Ingram's book will be out this fall, and there are flyers should you want to take them with you.
With a 40% discount if
Oh,
anybody
wow.
wants to do.
So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.